Political upheaval in Israel. Prime Minister Naftali Bennett and Foreign Minister Yair Lapid are disbanding their coalition government. The country is now facing its fifth national election in 3.5 years.
A vote to dissolve the Knesset could take place as early as tomorrow, and new elections are expected in the fall. CBN Middle East Bureau Chief Chris Mitchell reports on what's happening in the meantime.
The announcement on national television preempted a Knesset vote on Wednesday that was likely to bring down the government anyway.
My friend, Foreign Minister Yair Lapid, and I decided to work together to dissolve the Knesset and to set to hold elections at an agreed time, at the same time transferring the power in an orderly manner and ensuring the national interest of the State of Israel.
Over the last month, the coalition destabilized by the withdrawal of coalition members. Bennett said he had fought hard to maintain the coalition.
In recent weeks, we have done everything that could be done to preserve this government, which in our eyes, its continued existence is in the national interest.
The decision transfers power to Lapid, who becomes prime minister and remains foreign minister during the transition. Elections are scheduled for October 25th. Lapid commended Bennett for putting the country's interests ahead of his own.
Even if we're going to elections in a few months, our challenges as a state cannot wait. We must address the high cost of living, manage the struggle against Iran, Hamas, and Hezbollah, and face the forces that threaten to make Israel an undemocratic state.
The government was the most diversified in Israel's history, uniting 8 parties, not only from the left and right, but for the first time, including an Arab Islamist party. Defense Minister Benny Gantz tweeted, "Tonight, we are unfortunately closing a chapter on the government of change, a government who in a year of its activity has done a lot for Israeli society, its security, and its resilience, and will continue to operate during the transition period." Opposition leader Benjamin Netanyahu, who stands to gain the most, took the credit for the fall of the government.
This is an evening of great news for the citizens of Israel. After a determined struggle of the opposition in the Knesset and great suffering of the public in Israel, it is clear to everyone that the most failing government in the history of the country has ended its way.
Netanyahu charged that the government was dependent on a party that supported terrorists and vowed not to sit in a government with the Islamist party of Mansour Abbas.
My friends and I will form a broad national government headed by the Likud, a government that will lower taxes, that will lower prices, will lead Israel to tremendous achievements, including expanding the circle of peace as we have already done, and above all, a government that will return the national pride to the citizens of Israel so that you can walk the streets with your head held high.
The next few months are likely to be turbulent, including the visit of President Biden, continuing threats from Iran, and a political reshuffle the likes of which Israel has probably never seen. Gordon?
Well, Chris, can you give us the inside look on what happened? It doesn't seem like Israel can keep a government together very long. What's going on politically?
Well, politically, Gordon, the coalition was really built on one main pillar: to keep Benjamin Netanyahu out of power. That was the one thing, the glue that kept everyone together. Even though many of them shared the same right-wing ideology, they didn't want to sit with Netanyahu. You know, Israel's still a right-wing country. You know, more than 70 Knesset members came from the right wing, but instead you had Knesset members sitting together that didn't share the same ideology, right-wing parties, believe it or not, Gordon, sitting with the Islamist party linked to the Muslim Brotherhood. To use a U.S. analogy, is sort of like putting Ted Cruz in the same government along AOC. So those internal contradictions were simply too much. And then the defections, about 3 of them, they came from Prime Minister Bennett's own party. So when the third one threatened to leave the coalition, Bennett and Lapid knew the end was in sight, so they pulled the plug.
Well, is Netanyahu the net beneficiary of all this? Do you think he's going to win when the elections come?
Well, there's possible. There's 2 ways that he could win. Believe it or not, Gordon, Netanyahu still has an opportunity to form an alternative government before that vote to dissolve the Knesset comes along. To do that, he's going to have to convince several members from these right-wing parties to join the opposition. And that might be a safer bet than elections. It's probably improbable, but it is possible. One Likud member told me that if elections were held in October, like they say, and if Netanyahu couldn't form a majority, he might get pressure from the inside of Likud to step aside. So if he can form a government, that's a safer bet. But still, if he goes to elections, the Likud is still the largest party in the parliament, and a majority of Israelis, they prefer Netanyahu 3-1 to be prime minister. In the meantime, you're going to have a great political shuffle going on, Gordon. Some of these current parties might not even make what's called a threshold, a 3.5%, and get into the next Knesset. So you're going to have a lot of horse trading, a lot of maneuvering if they go to elections in about 90 days.
Well, is this an opportunity, as long as Israel is confused and who's really running the country, is this an opportunity for the Palestinians, for Hamas, for Hezbollah, for the Iranians? Is this an opportunity for them to take advantage of?
Well, it's possible. The Palestinians may see this as an opening. If Yair Lapid is the caretaker prime minister, unlike Bennett, he supports a two-state solution. So he might be more amenable to doing confidence-building measures, as they say. For example, no building in Judea and Samaria. In terms of the Iranians, it's likely that lately there's been a ratcheting up of the attacks between Israel and Iran. But for Israel, they will have some continuity in terms of Iran. They still have the same defense minister. In fact, Benny Gantz, the defense minister, just announced yesterday that there's a regional defense alliance against Iran that's led by the U.S. And he says they've already stopped Iranian attacks, but still Israel needs to be careful. Lapid, if he is the caretaker prime minister, he's still inexperienced. Certainly a time to be praying for the protection of Israel and here the peace of Jerusalem.
Well, let's talk about Saudi Arabia. Let's talk about President Biden's trip in July. I assume that trip is all about seeing if Saudi Arabia would join with the Abraham Accords and actually come to recognize Israel, exchange ambassadors, and go along with what other nations in the Gulf are doing. So how will this political uncertainty affect that and affect the potential for peace?
Well, it remains to be seen. It's not only just the Abraham Accords, Gordon, but also he's going to Saudi Arabia to try to get more oil produced by the Desert Kingdom so they can reduce the price of gas in the U.S. But right now, I think there would be still an impetus, even though with a caretaker government here in Israel, I think both the Bennett government and Lapid, as well as Netanyahu before that, they certainly did want to have the Abraham Accords, and certainly Saudi Arabia being the #1 country in the Middle East to go ahead and restore or normalize relations with Israel. So I think eventually that's going to happen. Whether or not it happens with Biden's visit remains to be seen. There's certainly going to be a lot of impetus to try to do that. But certainly in the long run, it seems that there will be some normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia.
All right, Chris, thanks for the insights, and we look forward to more reports. I don't think anything's going to be solved until the elections happen, so you're going to have a whole summer of a lot of work. Thanks for being with us.